what has been well established is that the pressures on biodiversity has increased manifold, and it is essentially because of habitat loss, degradation, climate change, excessive nutrient load and other forms of pollution, overexploitation and unsustainable use, and invasive alien species. Now, just a quick reminder that disasters are increasing and their intensity and frequency is going to increase much more, which is further going to cause damage to life and property. It's important for us to remember this because when we argue for projects and when we argue for location of something based on instrumental logic, we forget that there is a relational element to whatever we are discussing. And I think that's part of the problem of the way in which we think about a given problem. If the logic is going to be highly sort of instrumental rationality and not necessarily understand the relational elements, it's going to lead to fallacious thinking and fallacious decision making. Okay, underlying drivers of risk that's currently affecting poverty and disasters. There is the vulnerability of rural livelihoods, poor urban governance and local governance, and sometimes I wonder whether we are adding to poor urban governance by putting pressures of a certain kind on systems which may not necessarily have the same sort of knowledge base, the database and the resources. So I think we might be adding to poor local governance, poor urban governance, by coming up with ideas, suggestions which might be quite bizarre from the environmental perspective. Ecosystem decline and climate change, which has now sort of well proven that it has a cascading, magnifying impact. Now, we also need to recognize that CRZ and EIAs are embedded within these global and macro processes. So when we say that CRZ should solve all the problems of the world, I think there is a fundamental problem. We cannot expect CRZ regulation to operate in isolation from everything else that's going on. So the nature of interrelationship that we need to look at with CRZ, and I think property regime was mentioned by the previous speaker. So there are a whole range of policy issues which need to coalesce together in trying to look at what we expect CRZ to deliver. All right. How does one then reconcile interests? That's our fundamental problem. The first element is of interpretation, and I think yesterday there were a number of arguments that were made where we talked of differing interpretation. In fact, in the morning was also mentioned that every word matters. What do we mean by a given terminology? The position of words, the location of a certain comma, I think all this becomes important. I want to also flag a question of whose interests are being served in the decision-making process. Do we keep the idea of the guiding principles of CRZ in the decision-making process? I think that would help solve a lot of problems because the contestation is really around issues of investments, return on capital, and not necessarily on the environmental issues. And with environmental issues, we are also talking about global sustainability. Can you really cost it? Can you really put money value to it? I think there is a lot of work that's happening across the globe on that very element, and which is precisely the reason why there is a huge debate in the sustainability arena. So I think we need to recognize that looking at a given project and trying to interface with CRZ as a bottleneck is the fundamental sort of flaw in the way in which we expect CRZ to deliver. So I want to really sort of argue that CRZ is just one element of a larger context. The other question is short-term private interests very often jeopardize long-term ecological security. Is that what is happening when we argue for decision making in a given direction? My suggestion would be that if we create a set of non-negotiables, that certain things you definitely cannot sort of do, like in fragile systems, you cannot do tourism, or in certain areas, you cannot do something without maybe A, B, C, D, E, F safeguards. So I think having a set of non-negotiables may be the way forward, and this has to be put forth by maybe policymakers. Okay, coordination of government departments is critical to CRZ. I think this is something that all of us who work in any sector recognize, that there's very little coordination. There's one arm of the government telling you something, another arm telling you something else. I think yesterday the BPT example was a good example of how, while from the environmental perspective something is positive, from another element you are given another contradictory sense of direction. Okay. I would also argue for strict penal provisions guided by public trust doctrine, which fixes responsibility on bureaucrats, on public officials, to ensure implementation or violations. So it's not just that you penalize the private sector, but you also need to penalize people who are expected to uphold a certain philosophy, a certain idea, and that would probably enable a more, shall I say, a focus with greater integrity. If bureaucrats are to perform their functions with much greater integrity, I think this is needed. You see, what we also see is that science is very, people like to say that, I'm a scientist. But the reality of today's world is that science is imperfect. Science can prove something one way or the other, because there are a whole range of elements which could behave differently in different contexts. For example, in India, when the Tehri Dam was being proposed, there were two very clear group of scientists, one saying that your seismic activity is going to increase, so don't have such a massive dam in a fragile ecosystem like the Himalayas. There's another set of scientists who said, no, it's fine. So I think we know for sure that scientists, if paid enough money, if enough stakes are integrated, if enough interests are taken care of, they would vote in a given direction. So I think the idea that science is objective and neutral and so on, I think is, we are now living not in a fool's paradise. We know that scientists can give verdicts one way or the other. So that's something that I wanted to flag, because many of us here are we represent science. We also work with different interest groups, including industry. All right, this is my last slide. Do we look at CRZ to addressing issues of equity and development? When we go to courts, what the courts are actually doing is looking at some of these fundamental principles and telling you whether, they weigh pros and cons and they give you a verdict. Now, why is it that we want courts to do this? Precisely because we are unable to balance the development agenda and the environmental agenda or the equity agenda. So if the courts can do it, I think enlightened decision makers within industry, within the government, could also do the same. The problem is we don't want to do it because of pulls and pressures in diverse directions. Finally, I think rather than looking at regulation, if we start looking at management, that means we need to look at coastal management as a collective responsibility rather than the responsibility of somebody somewhere who is not necessarily doing what they ought to be doing. So I think that would also put some onus on planners to say what is the kind of planning that is needed in a given stretch of the coast. So if we move in that direction, and which is what the committee's Swaminathan committee had talked about, that might be also a way forward. So thank you very much. I'm done.